The dream began as they so often did, with a sense of not beginning at all. Elias was simply there, standing on a vast gray plain beneath a sky the color of unpolished pewter. The air was still and silent, a held breath. Before him stood a door. It was an utterly ordinary door, painted a faded green with a tarnished brass knob and a small, frosted glass window at its top. It was the kind of door one might find in a quiet suburban house, and its mundane nature in this stark, limitless landscape was profoundly unsettling. He felt no fear, only a deep, resonant curiosity, a pull as tangible as a thread tied to his sternum. His hand reached out seemingly of its own volition and closed around the cool metal of the knob. It turned with a smooth, well-oiled click. He pushed and the door swung inward onto darkness. He stepped through. The world dissolved and reformed in the space between one heartbeat and the next. He was no longer on the plain. He was in a library. It was immense, a cathedral of knowledge. Bookshelves of dark, rich mahogany soared towards a distant, vaulted ceiling where painted constellations swirled slowly in a perpetual, star-dusted twilight. The air smelled of old paper, leather, and the faint, clean scent of ozone. A spiral staircase of intricate ironwork twisted up into the shadows, and ladders on brass rails stood sentinel before the towering shelves. In the center of this vast room, under the soft glow of a green-shaded lamp, sat a man at a large, cluttered desk. He was elderly, with a kind, wrinkled face and eyes that held the gentle light of 1,000 reed stories. He looked up as Elias approached, his smile warm and knowing. "Ah, you've arrived," the old man said, his voice a soft rustle of pages. "I am the librarian we have been waiting." "Waiting for what?" Elias asked, his own voice sounding small in the grandeur of the room. "For you to choose," the librarian replied, gesturing to the endless shelves. "Every book here is a life, a story yet to be lived. Pick one, anyone. It is time for your dream to begin." Elias walked slowly to the nearest shelf. The books were bound in every conceivable material: leather, cloth, vellum, even what looked like woven bark or beaten metal. Their spines were inscribed with titles in languages he could not read, and some with no words at all. His fingers trailed across them, feeling the varied textures, the thrum of potential energy that seemed to vibrate from within. One book, bound in a deep blue leather that felt like the night sky, seemed to hum under his touch. He carefully slid it from its place. The title on the spine was in a simple, clear script he could understand: The Clockmaker of Ethelberg. He carried it back to the desk. The librarian nodded, his expression one of quiet approval. "A fine choice, a story of intricate work. Now find a comfortable chair. Read, live." Elias found a high-backed armchair near a tall, arched window that looked out onto a city of winding cobblestone streets and gas lamps just beginning to flicker on in a perpetual dusk. He settled into the chair, the leather creaking softly beneath him, and opened the book. The words on the first page did not simply sit there to be read, they flowed up and into him. The library dissolved, its scents and sounds replaced by the smell of hot metal, oil, and sawdust. The feeling of the armchair melted away, replaced by the solid wood of a stool. He was no longer Elias, the dreamer in the library. He was now Leo, the clockmaker. He was in a small, warm workshop, hunched over a complex array of tiny gears and springs spread on a soft cloth. The light from a single bright lamp illuminated his work. His hands, older, more calloused, moved with a precise, practiced grace as he used a fine-tipped tool to adjust the hairspring of a miniature escapement. The world had shrunk to this bench, this mechanism, this single, perfect task. This was his life. He was Leo, and he had always been Leo. The memory of the gray plain and the vast library was a vague, half-remembered dream from childhood, nothing more. Days in Ethelberg were marked by the slow arc of the sun across his workshop window and the steady, metronomic tick of 100 clocks on his walls. Nights were for reading by the fire, the book in his lap not one of blue leather but a thick volume on horological theory. He was content in his solitude, his world ordered and predictable. One afternoon a woman entered his shop. The bell above the door chimed, a sound he usually found an intrusion, but this time it felt different. She was tall, with eyes the color of the sea during a storm, and her presence seemed to change the very air in the room. She introduced herself as Elias, a historian from a distant city. She had heard of his skill, she said, and needed his expertise. She placed a small, locked box on his counter. It was made of a strange, dark wood, inlaid with silver patterns that swirled like captured smoke. "It is said to contain a map," she explained, her voice low and earnest. "A map to a place that does not exist on any chart, but the lock, it is not a normal lock. I have been told it is a time lock, and that only a master clockmaker could understand its mechanism." Leo's curiosity, a flame he had long kept banked, roared to life. He examined the box. There was no keyhole, only a series of concentric silver dials, each marked with minuscule, unfamiliar symbols. As he tilted it, he could hear the faint, liquid whisper of gears moving inside. "I can try," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "but it will take time." "I have time," Elias replied, and she smiled. And so she became a part of his ordered world. She would visit his shop daily, sitting quietly in the corner as he worked, sometimes asking questions about his craft, other times simply reading. He found himself looking forward to the chime of the door, to the scent of rain and parchment that seemed to follow her. As he worked on the puzzle of the box, he felt another, more delicate mechanism awakening within himself, his own heart. One evening, frustrated after a long day of failed approaches, Leo fell asleep at his workbench, his head resting on his arms amidst the scattered tools and schematics. And he dreamed. In this dream within the dream, he was not Leo the clockmaker. He was Elias once more, back in the vast library. The dream had a hazy, underwater quality. The towering bookshelves seemed to waver, and the painted constellations on the ceiling swirled faster, like leaves in a storm. The librarian was still at his desk, but he looked different, strained, his kindly face etched with concern. "Elias," the librarian said, his voice echoing as if from a great distance, "you are becoming too engrossed, you are forgetting the framework. This is a story within a story, the box, Elias, they are part of the narrative, do not lose yourself." Elias, confused, looked down at his hands. They were his own young hands, not Leo's calloused ones, but it feels real, she feels real. "The most potent stories always do," the librarian sighed, a sound like a book closing. "But you must remember the door, the green door, it is your way back. If you forget, you may become trapped in the second layer and the dream will become a cage. Now wake up, he is coming." The dream shattered. Leo jolted awake at his bench, his heart hammering. The workshop was dark, the only light coming from the embers in the fireplace. The memory of the library was already fading, becoming nonsensical. A dream about a library, a green door, it meant nothing. He was Leo, he had a box to open. He rubbed his eyes and looked down. The box was on the bench before him. In his sleep, his fingers must have brushed against the dials. They had moved, and with a final, soft click, the lid of the box sprang open. Inside, there was no map. There was only a single, perfect, crystalline key. It caught the faint light from the embers and fractured it into a dozen tiny rainbows on the wall. As he stared at it, the shop door burst open. It was not Elias. It was a man clad in a black coat, his face hidden in shadow. He moved with a predatory grace. "The key," the man hissed, his voice like grinding stones. "You have opened it, give it to me." Leo stood, clutching the key. "Who are you?" "I am the warden," the man said, stepping forward. "And you, clockmaker, are living in a borrowed world. This city, your life, it is not yours, it is a construct, a fiction. That key is a flaw in the narrative, and I am here to correct it." The warden lunged. Leo, acting on an instinct he didn't know he possessed, dodged aside. His hand closed around a heavy metal caliper. The two men struggled in the dim workshop, a chaotic ballet amidst the ticking clocks. It was a fight for something Leo did not fully understand, a conflict that felt far bigger than a simple theft. It was a fight for the reality of his very existence. He managed to shove the warden back, sending him stumbling into a tall grandfather clock. The glass face shattered, and the complex movement of gears and weights crashed to the floor with a sound like 100 bells breaking. In that moment of chaos, Leo ran. He fled his workshop out into the cobblestone streets of Ethelberg, the crystalline key clutched tightly in his fist. The city he knew so well had changed. The streets seemed to twist in impossible ways, leading him in circles. The gas lamps flickered erratically. He saw glimpses of the gray plane of his first dream in the spaces between buildings, like a canvas showing through cracked paint. The dream was fraying at the edges. He ran until he found himself in a dead-end alley, his back against a cold stone wall. He was trapped. The warden stepped into the alley's entrance, blocking his escape. "There is nowhere to go, clockmaker," the warden said, advancing slowly. "You cannot outrun the waking world." In that moment of absolute desperation, a memory, sharp and clear, pierced through the fog of Leo's mind. The librarian's words, "Remember the door, the green door." It was just a dream, a fragment of a nonsense dream from the night before, but it was all he had. He squeezed his eyes shut, ignoring the advancing warden, and concentrated with every fiber of his being. He pictured the vast, gray plain. He pictured the utter ordinariness of the green door, the faded paint, the tarnished knob, the frosted glass. He reached out with his mind, and his hand in the alley closed around a doorknob that was not there. He pulled. The world did not so much dissolve as it simply ceased to be. The stone wall vanished from his back. The sound of the warden's footsteps disappeared. He was falling, tumbling through a vortex of color and sound, a cacophony of ticking clocks and rustling pages and Alara's voice calling his name. He landed with a soft thud on a smooth wooden floor. He was back in the immense, silent library. He was Elias again, lying on the floor next to the high-backed armchair. The blue leather book, The Clockmaker of Ethelberg, lay open on the floor beside him, its pages now blank. Trembling, he pushed himself up. The librarian was watching him from his desk, his expression a mixture of relief and profound sadness. "You cut it very close, Elias," the librarian said softly. "The narrative almost consumed you. The warden is a necessary function. He terminates stories that become too unstable, too real for the dreamer. You were lucky to remember the door." Elias stood, his legs unsteady. The memories were now clear and distinct, two sets of them. One, a lifetime of being Leo, of smelling oil and metal, of feeling a growing affection for a woman named Alara. The other, his true self, stepping through a green door into this library. The conflict was dizzying. It felt more real than this," Elias whispered, gesturing to the peaceful, endless library. "Does it?" the librarian asked, a gentle smile touching his lips. "Look at your hand." Elias looked down. Clutched in his white-knuckled fist, brought with him from the dream within the dream, was the crystalline key. It was cool and solid, its facets glittering in the lamplight. A perfect, impossible object, a souvenir from a story. How was all he could manage? "The lines are not as clear as you believe," the librarian said. "Now you should go. This dream is ending. The dreamer is beginning to wake." Elias felt a familiar pull, a sense of upward motion. The library began to grow hazy, its colors bleeding together. The towering bookshelves became vague, shimmering outlines. "Wait," Elias called out. "What about Leo? What about Alara?" The librarian's form was becoming transparent. "Their story continues," his voice echoed, faint and far away. "It is a book on a shelf. Perhaps one day you will read it again and find out what happened after you left, or perhaps another dreamer will. Every book awaits its reader." The world faded to white. The last thing Elias saw was the crystalline key in his hand, its rainbow light the final anchor to a world that was and yet was not. He awoke in his own bed in his own room. The early morning sun streamed through the window. For a long moment he lay perfectly still, the vivid, layered reality of the dream clinging to him like cobwebs. He could still smell the old paper of the library, the oil of the workshop. He could still feel the weight of the key in his hand. He sat up, swung his legs over the side of the bed, and looked down at his empty, open palm. It was empty. Of course it was. It was a dream. A complex, profound, and terrifying dream, but a dream nonetheless. He let out a long, slow breath, a mixture of relief and a strange, profound loss. Leo's life, his feelings, his struggles, all were gone, evaporated into the insubstantial air of sleep. He stood and walked to the window. Looking out at the waking world, it seemed duller, flatter after the rich textures of his dream. He turned to get ready for the day, his mind already beginning to let go of the night's intricate tapestry. And as he turned, his foot brushed against something small and hard that skittered across the wooden floor. He froze. His heart, for the second time that morning, began to hammer against his ribs. He didn't want to look, he was afraid to look. Slowly, reluctantly, he lowered his gaze to the floorboards near his feet. There, lying where it had fallen, catching the morning sun and casting tiny, fractured specks of colored light upon the wood, was a single, perfect, crystalline key. The air in his small bedroom vanished. He could not draw breath. The mundane sounds of the waking world, a distant car horn, the chatter of sparrows on his windowsill, receded into a dull, roaring silence. His entire being, his sanity, was funneled down to that single, impossible object on the floor. It was here, in his world, in what he knew with a desperate, crumbling certainty to be reality. He did not move for a full minute, a statue of disbelief and dread. Then, slowly, as if approaching a venomous serpent, he knelt. His fingers trembled as they hovered over the key. He expected it to be an illusion, a trick of the light, a fragment of dream stuff that would dissolve at his touch. It was cold, solid, unmistakably real. He picked it up. The weight of it was absurd, an anchor from a phantom sea now dropped into his terrestrial life. The facets bit into his palm, a painful, wonderful confirmation. The librarian's final, echoing words came back to him, "The lines are not as clear as you believe." A frantic energy seized him. He scrambled to his desk, a chaotic landscape of unpaid bills, loose pens, and a dormant laptop. He shoved it all aside, clearing a space in the center. He placed the key there. It sat, glowing with an internal light that had no source in his sunlit room, a tear in the fabric of his universe. Questions erupted in his mind, a firestorm of panic and wonder. Had he brought it back, or had it always been here and the dream was merely a memory of finding it? No, that felt wrong. The dream had the quality of invention, of narrative. This key was a relic, a proof. He thought of Leo's workshop. The smell of oil, the feel of the tiny gears, the look in Alara's storm-gray eyes. It hadn't felt like a dream, it had felt like a life. And he, Elias, had been a ghost in that machine, a possessing spirit who had fled at the first sign of real danger, abandoning Leo to his fate. The thought was a shard of ice in his gut. What had happened after he pulled the door open? Did the warden simply win? Did the story of Ethelberg collapse into nothingness, its characters frozen in a moment of interrupted time? Or was it still going on, a play without its principal actor? He spent the day in a haze. He called in sick to work, his voice a stranger's. He paced his apartment, his eyes constantly dragged back to the key on the desk. It was a question he could not answer, a lock for which he had no door. He tried to research, his fingers flying across the keyboard. Crystalline keys in dreams, dreams that feel more real than reality, bringing objects back from dreams. The search results were a carnival of pseudoscience and forum lunacy, nothing that came close to the chilling, specific truth of the object on his desk. As evening fell, casting long shadows across the room, a new, terrifying thought occurred to him. If he could bring something out, could something from there come in? He thought of the warden, the man in the black coat with the voice of grinding stones. "I am the warden, I am here to correct it." The warden wasn't just a character, he was a custodian, an enforcer of the boundary between dream and waking, and Elias had just violated that boundary in the most blatant way possible. He shot up from his chair and began frantically checking the locks on his doors and windows. It was absurd. It was the behavior of a madman, but the key was absurd and it was real. His heart pounded a frantic rhythm against his ribs. Every creak of the old apartment building, every footstep in the hall sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through him. He was being hunted, not in a dream but here, in his home. He didn't sleep that night. He sat in a chair facing the door, the crystalline key clutched in his hand, its coolness the only thing that felt authentic in a world that had suddenly become a flimsy stage set. The streetlights cast shifting patterns through the blinds, and in every moving shadow he saw the silhouette of a long coat. By the following morning, exhaustion had sanded the sharp edges off his fear, leaving behind a gritty, determined resolve. Hiding and waiting was not an option. He had to understand. He had to go back not as a passive reader but as an active participant. He had to find out what happened to Leo, to Alara. He had to know if the warden could truly cross over. The problem was he didn't know how. He couldn't just decide to dream that specific layered dream again. It had found him. He spent the day in a state of heightened awareness, treating his own reality like a crime scene, looking for clues, for cracks. He stared at the patterns in the wood grain of his desk, searching for the silver swirls of Alara's box. He listened to the rhythm of the city, trying to hear the metronomic tick of 100 clocks. Nothing. It was only when true night fell and he lay in bed, forcing his body to be still, that he remembered the feeling. Not the library, not the workshop, but the transition. The act of stepping through. The cool brass of the knob, the sigh of the hinges, the green paint faded and chipped. He focused everything on that door. He built it in his mind, plank by plank. He pictured the exact shade of green, the way the light from the frosted glass was diffused and soft. He imagined the weight of the knob in his hand, the resistance before it turned. He poured all his intent, all his desperate need into that single, simple image. Click. It was not a sound in the room, it was a sound in his soul. He sat up, or the dream equivalent of sitting up, and he was there. On the vast, gray plain, the air was still and silent, and before him stood the green door. It was real, he had done it. But something was wrong. The door was different. The green paint was now blistered and peeling in large patches. The brass knob was heavily tarnished, almost black, and the frosted glass in the top panel was webbed with a spider's crack as if it had been struck from the other side. The dream was damaged. He approached cautiously, the memory of the warden fresh in his mind. He reached for the knob, his heart thundering. This time the turn was not smooth, it grated, sticking for a moment before yielding with a groan of protesting metal. He pushed the door open. The transition was not a gentle dissolution. It was a violent lurch. He was thrown into the library, but it was a library in chaos. Books had been pulled from their shelves and lay scattered across the floor like fallen birds. Several of the towering bookshelves were tilted at dangerous angles. The painted constellations on the ceiling swirled in a frantic, dizzying vortex, their colors bleeding into each other like a wet painting. The air, once scented with ozone and paper, now smelled of dust and something acrid like burnt wire. The librarian was at his desk, but he was hunched over, his head in his hands. He looked up as Elias stumbled in. His face was pale, etched with deep lines of strain and fear. The gentle light in his eyes was gone, replaced by a frantic glitter. "You," the librarian gasped, his voice raw. "You should not have come back, you broke it, you took something that was not yours to take." "The key," Elias said, his own voice steady despite the chaos. "I brought it back." "I know," the librarian wailed, gesturing wildly at the turmoil around them. "The balance is disrupted, the warden, he is furious, the integrity of the narrative is compromised. He is not just a function within the stories anymore, he is aware of you, of the world above, he seeks the key, he seeks to close the breach you opened." "Where is Leo?" Elias demanded, stepping forward. "What happened to him?" The librarian pointed a shaking finger towards the spiral staircase. "The book, it's still there, on the reading stand by the window, but it's unstable. Go, see for yourself, but be quick, he is coming." Elias didn't need to be told twice. He ran, his feet slipping on scattered pages. He reached the familiar alcove. The blue leather book lay on the stand, open, but the text was wrong. The words shimmered and writhed on the page, sometimes legible, sometimes dissolving into static. He saw Leo's name, then it blurred. He saw Elias, then it faded. He leaned closer, squinting, and the world dropped out from under him once more. He was back in the alley in Ethelberg, but it was a corrupted version. The cobblestones were shifting underfoot, their edges blurry. The walls of the buildings flickered, sometimes solid stone, sometimes revealing the gray plain or, terrifyingly, the chaotic interior of the library behind them. The sky was a sickly, pulsating bruise of color. And there was Leo. He was backed against the same wall, but he was different. He looked thin, translucent. His form flickered much like the walls. Standing before him was the warden, but he was more solid, more real than anything else in the scene. His presence was a blot of absolute darkness, a hole in the fraying dream. "You are an echo," the warden was saying to Leo, his voice now carrying the same grinding quality Elias had heard in his own apartment. "A shadow cast by the dreamer, he has abandoned you, your function is over." The warden raised his hand, and it wasn't a hand anymore. It was a construct of shifting, sharp shadows, poised to erase the flickering form of the clockmaker. "No," Elias shouted. The sound was not Leo's voice. It was his own, Elias, echoing strangely in the unstable space. Both the warden and Leo turned. Leo's eyes, wide with confusion and a dawning, impossible recognition, met his. The warden's featureless face shifted towards him. "The dreamer," the warden intoned. "You have returned to the scene of the crime, you will return what you have stolen, you will submit to correction." The warden began to advance towards Elias, abandoning the fatting Leo. This was his chance. This was why he had come back. He wasn't just a reader anymore, he was a character with agency. He had the one thing that didn't belong, the flaw in the narrative. He thought of the key, not the physical one in his waking world, but the idea of it. The concept of a tool that could unlock anything. He focused on that idea, pouring his will into it here in the heart of the dream. A warmth flared in his hand. He looked down. The crystalline key was there, shimmering into existence in his dream hand, a perfect replica of the one on his desk at home. The warden stopped. A ripple of what might have been uncertainty passed through his dark form. Elias didn't know what the key unlocked. The box was gone. The map was a fiction, but maybe it wasn't for unlocking a thing, maybe it was for unlocking a state. He looked past the warden at Leo, who was watching him, a spark of his old, steady intelligence returning to his eyes. Leo gave a slow, deliberate nod. Elias turned and with all his strength plunged the key not into a lock, but into the flickering, unstable wall of the alley itself. There was no sound, but a wave of pure silence exploded outwards. The key flared with a light so brilliant it was black and white and every color at once. The fissure in the wall where the key met it spread not a crack of destruction but a seam of brilliant, solid light. The blurry edges of the world sharpened, the flickering stopped, the cobblestones settled, the sky resolved into a deep, tranquil twilight. The warden let out a roar of pure frustration, but his form was already dissolving, not into nothingness but back into the background hum of the dream, his purpose thwarted by the restoration of stability. Elias turned back to Leo. The clockmaker was no longer translucent. He was whole, solid, real. He looked at Elias and there was no confusion now, only a deep, weary gratitude. "Thank you," Leo said, his voice firm. "You saved my world." "It's your world," Elias said. "I was just a visitor." "And now?" Leo asked. "Now I have to go," Elias said. He could feel the pull again, the waking world tugging at him. "Take care of her, take care of Alara." Leo nodded. "I will." Elias pulled the key from the wall. The moment it was free, the dream began to soften at the edges. He looked at Leo one last time, then closed his eyes and let the pull take him. He awoke in his bed. Dawn was just breaking. He was drenched in sweat, but his mind was clearer than it had been in days. He sat up and immediately looked at his desk. The crystalline key was still there. But it was different. It was no longer perfectly clear. At its very heart, a tiny, intricate golden gear had formed, suspended in the crystal, ticking with a soft, almost imperceptible sound. It was working. Somewhere in a city of winding cobblestone streets, a clockmaker was repairing a broken world, and a part of that world was now forever embedded in the key. Elias picked it up. It was no longer an object of terror but a promise. A connection. The lines were not clear. He lived in one world but he had a stake in another. He was a dreamer but he was also now a guardian. He placed the key carefully in a small wooden box on his shelf. He would go to work today, he would pay his bills, he would live his life. But he knew, with a certainty that was as solid as the key itself, that this was not the end. It was an intermission. The library was vast and every book awaited its reader, and he now knew